At 20, they said I was sterile. Then a stranger knocked on my door, called me dad, and showed me a scar only I was supposed to have. On today's episode of The Wanderer's Tales, we dive where quiet courage prevails. Hidden truths and hearts so bold, stories of fear left untold. If this calls to you, don't delay, subscribe, tap the bell, and stay with us. Thank you. The humidity in Lagos always felt like a heavy, wet blanket, but inside the air-conditioned sanctuary of Obina's Lekki office, the air was surgically cold. He remembered that cold from 15 years ago, sitting in a plastic chair in a clinic in Enugu, listening to a doctor with a voice like dry gravel tell him that his lineage ended with him. At 20, while other young men were celebrating their virility, Obina had been handed a certificate of emptiness. The diagnosis, bilateral cryptorchidism complications leading to permanent infertility, had become the silent third partner in his marriage to Nneka. It dictated their late-night conversations, their choice of a two-bedroom apartment over a sprawling family home, and the way Nneka would quietly turn off the television whenever a diaper commercial aired. He had made peace with the void, filling it with blueprints, steel structures, and the rhythmic clicking of a mouse. He was a man of logic and straight lines, a man who believed that if a foundation was flawed, the building could never stand. But logic is a fragile thing when the past decides to walk through the front gate of your life, uninvited and breathing. The knock didn't sound like a herald of destiny. It was hesitant, a light tapping against the reinforced mahogany of their front door that barely competed with the evening news blaring in the living room. When Obina opened it, the streetlights were flickering, casting long, distorted shadows across the driveway. Standing there was a boy, perhaps 12 or 13, wearing a faded school uniform that had seen better days and a look of terrified determination. His skin was the color of roasted cocoa, his eyes wide and searching, reflecting the porch light with an intensity that made Obina's breath hitch in his throat. Before Obina could ask if he was lost or looking for the neighborhood security guard, the boy's lower lip trembled, and a single word escaped his mouth, cutting through the humid night air like a jagged blade. "Dad," the boy whispered, his voice cracking with the weight of a decade of searching. Obina felt a cold sweat break across his neck, the phantom memory of that doctor's gravelly voice echoing in his ears. "You will never have children, Obina." Yet, as he looked into the boy's face, he saw a mirror of his own jawline, a terrifying biological echo that defied every medical fact he had used to build his life. For a long minute, the world narrowed down to the space between the man and the child, a vacuum where the sounds of Lagos, the distant hum of generators, the honking of Danfo buses simply ceased to exist. Obina wanted to laugh, to dismiss this as a cruel prank or a case of mistaken identity, but his legs felt like they were rooted into the concrete of the porch. Nneka appeared behind him, her silk wrap flowing like water, her face expectant until she saw the boy. The air in the room shifted instantly. She didn't ask who he was, she didn't offer a motherly smile. Instead, she recoiled as if she had seen a ghost, her hand flying to her throat where a pulse hammered visibly against her skin. The boy, sensing the wall of adult silence, reached out a hand, not to touch Obina, but to steady himself against the doorframe. As he moved, the sleeve of his oversized shirt slid back, revealing his forearm. There, etched into the dark skin, was a jagged silver-white scar in the shape of a lightning bolt, an identical twin to the mark Obina carried on his own arm, a souvenir from a kerosene explosion in his father's kitchen when he was 7. It was a mark no stranger could fake, a secret written in flesh that only those who had seen Obina naked could possibly know. Nneka's breath came in a sharp, ragged hitch, her eyes darting from the boy's arm to Obina's face, searching for a lie that wasn't there. "Who is this?" "Obina," she whispered, her voice laced with a sudden, sharp edge of betrayal that sliced through the confusion. Obina couldn't answer because his mind was a chaotic storm of dates and diagnoses. He looked at the boy, Toby, as he would later learn his name was, and saw the impossible. The boy didn't have his nose or his height, but that scar was a fingerprint of fate. "He called me Dad. Nneka," Obina managed to say, his voice sounding like it belonged to someone else, someone far away. The boy reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled, water-stained photograph, holding it out with a trembling hand. It was a wedding photo, the edges frayed and yellowed. Obinna recognized the suit he wore, the way he stood, the specific tilt of his head from his wedding day 10 years ago. But as he looked closer, his blood turned to ice. The woman in the photo standing next to him had Nneka's silhouette, but the name written on the back in elegant, fading script wasn't Nneka's. It was a name he hadn't heard in a lifetime, a name that belonged to a version of himself he thought had died in a car wreck 12 years ago. The photo in Obinna's hand felt heavier than its physical weight. The glossy finish cracked like a dried-up riverbed in the heart of the Sahel. It was undeniably him in the image, the same sharp-shouldered charcoal tuxedo he had rented from that overpriced boutique in Victoria Island, the same nervous, lopsided grin he'd worn because his Italian leather shoes were a size too small and pinching his toes. But the woman beside him was a smudge of white lace and haunting mystery. The water damage had been cruelest to her, blooming like a fungal infection across her face, leaving only the curve of slender jawline and the ghost of a smile that didn't quite match Nneka's fuller, more boisterous laugh. As he stared, his mind raced back to the infertility diagnosis that had been the foundation of his adult identity. He remembered the sterile, soul-crushing white walls of the Enugu clinic, the way the air smelled like industrial bleach and lost hope, and the crushing weight of the doctor's gravelly voice. Zero motility, zero chance. He had lived his life as a man who could not leave a legacy in blood, a man whose lineage would end with his last breath. Yet here was a boy with his exact lightning bolt scar, holding a physical piece of a past that Obinna's memory refused to acknowledge. The paradox was a physical weight in his chest, making it hard to breathe, as if the very air in his Lekki home had been replaced by the thick, muddy water of the Lagos Lagoon. He looked at Toby, who was watching him with a mixture of desperate hope and ancient terror, and for a fleeting, terrifying second, Obinna felt a surge of something he had suppressed for 15 years, the primal, thumping ache of fatherhood. It was a phantom limb sensation, a feeling of a connection that shouldn't exist by all laws of science, yet was throbbing with life right in front of him. How could a man who had been told his garden was barren produce a fruit so vivid, so familiar, and so hauntingly identical to himself? Nneka snatched the photo with a speed that bordered on violence, her breath coming in short, sharp whistles through her flared nostrils. Her eyes scanned the image, not with the curiosity of a shocked wife, but with the frantic, calculating desperation of a soldier looking for a breach in a fortress wall. She looked at the back of the photo, where the ink had bled into the fiber of the paper, turning the handwritten name, Amara, into a shadowy, dark bruise. Obinna watched her, and for the first time in their 12 years of marriage, he saw a total stranger standing in his living room. This wasn't the woman who made him ginger tea when he was stressed by architectural deadlines, or the woman who shared his silent, comfortable grief over their empty nursery. This was a woman guarding a secret so old it had grown teeth. "Where did you get this, boy?" she hissed, her voice dropping an octave, losing its melodic Lagos lilt, and becoming something sharp, jagged, and ancient. The boy flinched, retreating a step toward the flickering darkness of the driveway, his small shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. "My mother gave it to me," Toby whispered, his voice trembling but his gaze remaining locked on Obinna. "She said if anything happened to her, I should find the man in the photo. She said he was the only one who could protect me from the debt." The word debt hung in the humid air, heavy and ominous, sounding entirely unrelated to money, but dripping with a sense of karmic consequence. Nneka's face went pale, a sickly ashen color that stood out against the deep mahogany of her skin. She didn't look at Obinna. She looked through him, as if she were seeing a timeline he wasn't part of, a world where the laws of biology and marriage didn't apply. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the ghosts of the years they had spent building a life on a foundation of omission. Obinna realized then that the truth wasn't a single event he had missed, but a parallel world Nneka had been living in while he slept peacefully beside her. The following morning, the Lagos sun rose like a defiant orange orb, burning through the city's haze, but the light brought no clarity to the house in Lekki. Obinna couldn't go to the office. The blueprints on his desk felt like meaningless scratches compared to the biological blueprints standing in his guest room. While Nneka was locked in the master bedroom, claiming a migraine that smelled more like a panic attack, Obinna took Toby's small backpack and searched it with a guilt that made his stomach churn. Inside, tucked between a tattered math textbook and a spare shirt, he found a folded birth certificate from a public hospital in the outskirts of Enugu. The paper was thin and cheap, the kind given to those who couldn't afford the private clinics of the elite. His heart stopped when his eyes found the section for parental information. Under father, the space was a taunting blank line, but under mother, the name was written in clear, bold script. Nneka Okoro. It was his wife's maiden name. The dates, however, made his head spin like a malfunctioning compass. Toby had been born in August 2013. According to Obinna's own memory, he and Nneka hadn't even met until the Christmas of 2014 at a gala in Victoria Island. The math didn't just refuse to add up. It suggested a fracture in time itself. He looked at the boy eating a bowl of cereal at the kitchen island, the sunlight catching the same stubborn cowlick Obinna fought every morning in a mirror. If Nneka was the mother, she had carried this child, birthed him, and hidden him in the folds of the past before she ever stepped into Obinna's life. But how could the boy be his son if they hadn't met? Driven by a restless, manic energy, Obinna drove to the St. Jude's Medical Archives, a dusty, labyrinthine building where the city's history was buried in paper files and failing hard drives. The air inside was stagnant, smelling of old ink and the slow decay of records. He used his influence as a prominent architect to bypass the usual bureaucratic nightmare, eventually sitting before a terminal with a sympathetic clerk who looked like she'd been part of the furniture since the 70s. "I need to see the maternal records for Nneka Okoro, 2013, he said, his voice sounding hollow. As the clerk typed, the rhythmic clicking of the keyboard felt like a countdown to an explosion. When the file finally loaded, it wasn't just a birth record. It was a medical saga. The records showed a woman who had checked in under extreme duress, suffering for what the notes described as severe psychosomatic trauma. But it was the emergency contact that made the blood drain from Obinna's extremities. The contact person wasn't a parent or a sibling. It was a man named Obi, and the phone number listed was his own old mobile number, one he hadn't used since the car accident in 2012. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the solar plexus. He hadn't just met Nneka in 2014. He had known her before. He had known her in the gap, in the dark, silent months following the crash that the doctor said had wiped his short-term memory clean. He had been a father before he was a husband, a lover before he was a patient. And Nneka had been the architect of a grand reconstruction, building a new life on the ruins of a history she had deliberately chosen to bury. Returning home felt like entering a tomb that had been prematurely sealed. The house was silent, save for the low hum of the air conditioner and the distant, rhythmic chopping of the cook in the kitchen. Obinna found Nneka in the garden, staring at the hibiscus flowers as if they held the secrets to her survival. He dropped the photocopy of the birth certificate onto the glass table between them, the sound of the paper hitting the surface echoing like a gunshot in the quiet afternoon. "Tell me about August 2013, he said, his voice devoid of emotion, a cold, architectural precision taking over. Nneka didn't flinch. She didn't even look at the paper. She simply reached out and plucked a withered leaf from a nearby bush, her movements slow and deliberate. "I told you, Obinna. I have never been pregnant. I have never felt a child kick in my womb. I have never endured the labor you are implying." Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor in her hands that she couldn't hide, a microscopic shaking that betrayed the iron wall of her words. She looked him in the eye, and for a moment he saw the woman he loved, the woman who had stayed by his side through the lean years of his early career, who had never once complained about the lack of children. But behind that love was a layer of steel, a defensive mechanism that had been forged in a fire he wasn't allowed to see. "The records say otherwise, Nneka. Your maiden name, is on his birth certificate. My old phone number is on the emergency contact list. Obinna countered, his frustration bubbling over into a low, dangerous growl. He stepped closer, casting a shadow over her. You swore an oath when we married. You swore there were no secrets between us. Yet here is a boy who carries my mark, who carries your name, and you stand here telling me that the sun isn't in the sky. Nneka finally looked at him, and her eyes were swimming with a grief so profound it momentarily silenced his anger. She didn't look like a liar caught in a trap. She looked like a martyr who had finally reached the end of her endurance. There are different kinds of truth, Obinna, she whispered, her voice breaking. There is the truth that keeps you alive, and the truth that kills you. I chose the one that kept you breathing. She stood up, her silk dress rustling against the stones. I never stopped loving you, but I knew that if you remembered what happened before the accident, you wouldn't survive the weight of it. You want the truth? Then you have to accept that the man you think you are is a fiction I helped you write. She turned and walked back into the house, leaving him alone in the heat, the photocopy of the birth certificate fluttering in the breeze like a white flag of surrender in a war he didn't even know he was fighting. The tension in the house became a physical entity, a thick, invisible fog that made every meal a chore and every night a marathon of feigned sleep. Obinna knew he couldn't rely on Nneka's words, and he certainly couldn't trust his own fractured memory, which felt like a shattered mirror with half the pieces missing. He needed the cold, unyielding certainty of science. 2 days later, under the guise of taking Toby to buy new clothes and school supplies, Obinna drove the boy to a high-end private laboratory in Victoria Island. He had paid a premium for an expedited DNA paternity test, the kind that promised results in 48 hours with 99.9% accuracy. As the technician swiped the long cotton swab inside Toby's cheek, the boy looked at Obinna with a hauntingly adult expression. He didn't ask what they were doing. He seemed to understand that his very existence was on trial. Obinna felt a wave of self-loathing wash over him. How could he treat this child, who had lost his mother and traveled across the country alone, like a specimen in a jar? But the doubt was a parasite that wouldn't let go. If Toby wasn't his, then the scar was a coincidence, the photo was a forgery, and his life was still the quiet, sterile reality he had accepted. But if Toby was his, then everything he knew about himself, his wife, and his own body was a lie constructed by the person he trusted most. The 48 hours that followed were the longest of Obinna's life. He spent them in a state of hyper-awareness, noticing things he had previously overlooked. The way Nneka avoided Toby's gaze, the way she would startle at the sound of the boy's laughter, and the way she had begun to pack away the small mementos of their life together, as if preparing for a sudden departure. He found himself watching Toby sleep, tracing the lines of the boy's face in the moonlight, looking for the man he used to be. The boy slept with a quiet intensity, his hand often clutched near his chest, as if holding on to something precious even in his dreams. When the email notification finally chimed on Obinna's phone on a rainy Thursday afternoon, he was sitting in his car, parked by the Lekki link bridge, watching the gray water churn below. His fingers hovered over the screen, trembling with a fear that surpassed anything he had felt during the 2012 accident. He opened the PDF, his eyes scanning past the technical jargon and the statistical tables until they landed on the final conclusion. The probability of paternity is 99.99%, but it was the supplementary data that caused his heart to skip a beat. The genetic markers indicated a conception date that predated his marriage by nearly 2 years, but more shockingly, the lab had flagged a rare chromosomal anomaly. It was an anomaly that shouldn't exist in an infertile man, unless that man had undergone a specific, highly experimental procedure. The paper fell from his hands as the rain began to hammer against the windshield, a deafening roar that drowned out his own ragged breathing. He wasn't just a father. He was a medical impossibility, and the key to that impossibility was buried in the lost year Nneka had worked so hard to erase. The DNA report felt like a physical weight in Obinna's lap, the digital text on his phone screen blurring as the Lagos rain hammered against his windshield in a rhythmic, deafening percussion. The 99.99% probability of paternity was a biological verdict that should have been impossible, a direct contradiction to the medical death sentence he had carried since his 20th year. He remembered the cold, clinical air of the Enugu hospital, where he'd been told his dreams of a bloodline were over, a diagnosis that had shaped every decision, every sacrifice, and even the way he had allowed Nneka to love him. Yet, the report didn't just confirm he was Toby's father. It flagged a rare genetic sequence that indicated his reproductive system had undergone a profound, almost miraculous restoration, a phenomenon the lab notes described as post-traumatic biological recalibration. It suggested that the car accident in 2012, the very event that had stolen a year of his memory, had somehow rewired his body, turning a tragedy into a silent, secret fertility. As the wipers struggled against the deluge, Obinna realized that the truth he had lived for a decade was a carefully curated fiction, a reality built on a foundation of omission. The boy in his guest room wasn't just a child. He was the living evidence of a miracle that had been hidden from a man it belonged to, a masterpiece of biological survival that Nneka had watched over in a silence so deep it bordered on the sacred. The secondary data in the report was even more unsettling, providing a biological dating of the conception that acted like a temporal anchor, dragging him back to the months he could not remember. The markers suggested the child was conceived during the peak of his recovery, a time when he believed he was a broken man confined to a sterile bed, fighting to remember his own name. But the DNA told a story of a man who was very much alive, a man who had loved and been loved with a potency that defied his previous limitations. He stared at the name of the clinic mentioned in the report, the Zenith Restoration Center, a facility he had always assumed was a standard rehabilitation unit, but now appeared to be something far more experimental. The realization that Nneka had been there, that she had seen him in this state of recalibration, sent a chill through him that the car's heater couldn't touch. She had watched him become a father while he was too broken to know it, and then she had helped him walk away from that life into a new, sterile one. He felt like an architect who had discovered a hidden basement in a house he thought he had designed from scratch. The structure of his marriage, his identity as a childless professional, and his very sense of self were all crumbling under the weight of this impossible result, leaving him standing in the ruins of a life he no longer recognized as his own. Memory, Obinna realized, was not a continuous film, but a series of jagged, disconnected snapshots held together by the stories we tell ourselves. His lost year began on a Tuesday in 2012, on a treacherous stretch of the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway, where a burst tire had sent his car spinning into the abyss. He remembered the screech of metal, the smell of burning rubber, and then a vast, shimmering void that lasted for 12 months. When he awoke in 2013, Nneka was there, a gentle presence who told him he had been in a deep coma, that his recovery was a miracle, and that he should look forward, never backward. He had accepted her version of events because the alternative, a gaping hole in his soul, was too terrifying to contemplate. But now, as he sat in the quiet of his study, the void began to populate itself with ghost images, the scent of wood smoke, the sound of a woman humming a lullaby he didn't recognize, and the feeling of a small, warm hand clutching his own. These weren't memories of his life with Nneka. They were echoes from a parallel existence, a life lived in the humid, green shadows of a place far from the neon lights of Lekki. He began to suspect that the coma was a convenient lie, a shroud pulled over a year of vibrant, messy, and complicated living that Nneka had decided was too dangerous for him to keep. The more he tried to reach for these memories, the more the physical world seemed to rebel, his head throbbing with a dull, rhythmic ache that felt like a warning. He dug through his old journals, looking for any scrap of paper from that missing year, but found only a curated collection of sketches and notes that began precisely when Nneka said his recovery ended. It was too perfect, too clean, like a site that had been cleared of debris before a new building was erected. He realized that Nneka hadn't just cared for him. She had edited him. She had taken the shattered pieces of the man he was and assembled a new version, one that was safe, successful, and, most importantly, dependent on the narrative she provided. But Toby's presence was a glitch in the software, a virus that was slowly dismantling the artificial world Obinna had inhabited. The boy's laugh, his gait, and even the way he held a spoon were all keys turning in locks that Obinna didn't know existed. He felt a sudden, visceral anger at the woman sleeping in the next room, the woman who had appointed herself the gatekeeper of his mind. She had stolen a year of his life, a child, and perhaps a version of himself that was more real than the one he currently occupied. The lost year wasn't a tragedy of the brain. It was a conspiracy of the heart, and he was finally ready to burn the script Nneka had written for him. The confrontation happened in the kitchen, under the sterile, bright glare of the LED pendants that Obinna had installed to give the space a modern, efficient feel. Nneka was pouring a glass of water, her movements graceful and practiced, but her hand shook as she saw the DNA report lying on the marble island. Obinna didn't start with an accusation. He started with a question that had been burning a hole in his tongue. Why does a boy who shouldn't exist have my DNA and a scar that only you and I should know about? His voice was a low, dangerous vibration that seemed to make the very air in the room hum with tension. Nneka didn't look up, her gaze fixed on the rising bubbles in her glass, her silence a wall he had spent 12 years trying to scale. You told me I was infertile, Nneka. You watched me grieve for a family I thought I could never have. You let me build a life on a lie while you knew there was a child out there with my blood. The anger he had been suppressing finally broke through, a tidal wave of betrayal that crashed against her calm exterior. He stepped into her space, forcing her to acknowledge the physical evidence of her deception. The paper that proved his life was a meticulously crafted stage play. Nneka finally looked at him, and for the first time, the mask of the supportive wife shattered, revealing a woman who was exhausted by the weight of her own secrets. She didn't offer an excuse or a denial. She simply leaned against the counter and asked, "Which year do you want first, Obinna? Do you want the year you died, or the year you were reborn?" The question was so unexpected, so laden with a cryptic philosophical weight, that it took the air out of his lungs. She began to cry, but they weren't the tears of a woman caught in a lie. They were the tears of a woman who had been carrying a mountain on her shoulders for a decade. "I didn't steal your life," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I saved it from a version of you that was going to burn everything down. You weren't a victim of an accident. You were a victim of a choice. And Amara was the one who made that choice possible." The name Amara hit him like a physical blow, a key unlocking a chamber of his mind that had been sealed with iron. He saw a flash of a woman with eyes like amber and a voice like a warm evening breeze, a woman who wasn't Nneka, but who had loved him with a ferocity that his current life couldn't match. The truth wasn't a single event. It was a choice made in the dark, a sacrifice that had cost him his memory and Amara her life. Amara was the shadow that had been looming over Obinna's marriage since the beginning, a ghost he had sensed but never named. As Nneka spoke, the image of the woman in the blurred wedding photo began to take on color and depth, filling in the blanks of his fractured memory. Amara wasn't just a former lover. She was the woman who had found him after the accident, the one who had taken him to the experimental clinic when everyone else had given up on him. She was the one who had stayed by his side during the lost year, watching as his body healed in ways that science couldn't explain. Nneka described a version of Obinna that was wild, passionate, and deeply connected to a small village in the east, a man who had walked away from his architectural dreams to build something more primal and lasting. But that man was also a man in danger, hunted by debts and secrets that Amara had been trying to shield him from. Nneka had been the fixer, the woman who had been brought in to help him disappear, to give him a new identity and a new life in Lagos where the ghosts of the past couldn't find him. The cost of that safety, however, was the erasure of everything he had become during that year, including his child and the woman who had birthed him. The realization that Nneka and Amara had conspired together to save him was a bitter pill that Obinna couldn't swallow. He looked at Nneka, the woman who had been his anchor for 12 years, and saw a collaborator in his own mental kidnapping. "You decided for me," he said, his voice flat and cold. "You and Amara played God with my life. deciding what I should remember and who I should love. Neka reached out to touch his arm, but he flinched away, the touch feeling like a brand. She explained that Amara had been the one to insist on the silence, knowing that Obina's survival depended on him being a man with no past and no ties to the debt that still hung over her family. Amara had taken Toby and disappeared into the shadows, allowing Obina to live his sanitized, successful life in Lekki, while she lived a life of hiding and sacrifice. This shadow woman wasn't a rival. She was a guardian who had loved him enough to let him forget her. But now that Amara was dead, the protection was gone, and the debt was coming for Toby, and by extension, for Obina. The story was no longer about a secret pregnancy. It was about a man who had been a pawn in a game of survival, played by two women who loved him in ways he wasn't sure he could ever forgive. The Zenith Restoration Center was a name that began to appear in every document Obina unearthed, a facility that existed on the fringes of medical legality and traditional healing. Driven by a need to understand the physical reality of his recovery, Obina traveled to the outskirts of Enugu, to a place where the forests seemed to swallow the road. He found the ruins of the clinic, a collection of low-slung concrete buildings that were now overgrown with vines and reclaimed by the earth. It was here Neka had admitted that the recalibration had happened. He met an old man who had been a caretaker at the facility, a man with eyes clouded by cataracts, but a memory that was sharp as a razor. The old man spoke of the patient with a mark, a man who had been brought in more dead than alive, his body a map of trauma. But the treatments hadn't been just drugs and surgery. They had involved experimental gene therapies and local herbal concoctions that were rumored to jumpstart the body's most basic functions. The caretaker remembered Amara, the woman who had sold her family land to pay for the treatments, the woman who had sat by the bed and whispered life back into a man who had been discarded by the world. As Obina walked through the skeletal remains of the ward where he had supposedly spent months, he felt a strange, electric hum in his bones, a physical recognition of the space. This was where the miracle of his fertility had been born, a byproduct of a desperate attempt to save his life. The doctors hadn't just repaired his bones and brain. They had inadvertently reversed the damage of his youth, a biological reboot that no one had expected. But the cost of this miracle was the debt the caretaker kept mentioning, a contract signed in blood and desperation with a local syndicate that funded the clinic's more controversial research. Amara had been the guarantor of that debt, and when she couldn't pay with money, she had paid with her disappearance, taking the evidence of the miracle, Toby, with her. Obina realized that his success in Lagos, his beautiful home, and his prestigious career were all built on the foundation of Amara's suffering. He was a medical miracle, yes, but he was also a man who had been bought and paid for by a woman he didn't even remember. The lost year wasn't just a gap in time. It was a ledger of sacrifices that he was only now beginning to read, and the total was more than he could ever hope to repay. The weight of Neka's silence began to take on a different color as Obina dug deeper into the history of the Zenith Center and the syndicate that had funded it. He spent long nights in his study, the blue light of his laptop the only illumination as he traced the connections between the clinic and a series of disappearances in the early 2010s. Neka hadn't just been a fixer, she had been a protector, a woman who had used her own family's influence and resources to build a firewall around Obina. She had known that if the syndicate realized their successful experiment was thriving in Lagos, they would come to reclaim their investment, either for further study or for leverage. By letting Obina believe he was infertile and helping him build a life that was public but disconnected from his past, she had kept him under the radar. Every time she had stayed silent when he talked about their lack of children, she had been guarding him from a truth that would have made him a target. It was a sacrifice of silence, a daily, agonizing choice to be the villain in his story so that he could remain the hero in his own. He finally sat Neka down, not to interrogate her, but to listen to the parts of the story she had been too afraid to tell. She spoke of a night Amara had come to her, carrying a newborn Toby, and told her that the syndicate was closing in. Amara had made Nneka swear to take Obinna away, to give him a life where he was safe and clean, even if it meant Amara would never see him again. She knew you would never leave her if you remembered, Nneka whispered, her eyes fixed on the wedding ring she had worn for 12 years. And she knew that if you stayed, you would die. So we made a pact. I would take the man, and she would take the child. We thought we could keep the worlds separate forever. Obinna looked at his wife and saw the immense, lonely burden she had carried, the way she had lived with the ghost of another woman's love every single day. He realized that Nneka's lie wasn't an act of betrayal, but an act of profound, selfless devotion. She had loved a man who was only half there, a man who was a reconstruction of a person she had helped dismantle. The sacrifice of her own peace, her own integrity, and the chance to have her own biological children with him was a debt he could never fully comprehend, let alone repay. Toby was the bridge between the two worlds, a living, breathing fusion of the man Obinna was and the man he had been forgotten. As the days turned into weeks, Obinna began to spend more time with the boy, not as a suspicious stranger, but as a father trying to make up for a decade of absence. Toby told him stories of his life with Amara, a life of constant movement, of small villages and hidden rooms, of a mother who always kept a packed bag by the door. She told me you were a king who had to go away to protect the kingdom, Toby said one afternoon as they sat on the patio, the boy's eyes bright with a mix of pride and sadness. She said that one day, when the shadows were gone, I could go and find you. Amara had raised the boy on a diet of myth and memory, ensuring that even if Obinna didn't remember Toby, Toby would always know his father. She had kept the wedding photo, the only piece of the lost year she hadn't surrendered, as a compass for her son to follow when she was no longer there to guide him. The news of Amara's death, last year, began to take on a more sinister tone as Obinna investigated the circumstances. She hadn't died of illness or an accident. She had been found in a small house in Enugu, the victim of a break-in where nothing was stolen. Obinna realized with a jolt of terror that the shadows Amara had been running from had finally caught up to her. She had sent Toby to him not because she was dying, but because she knew she was being hunted. The boy's arrival in Lagos wasn't just a family reunion. It was an escape. Amara had given her life to ensure that Toby made it to the only person who could protect him, the man whose life she had already saved once before. Obinna felt a surge of protective fury, a primal fatherhood that surpassed anything he had ever felt. Toby wasn't just a reminder of a lost year. He was the legacy of a woman who had fought a war in the shadows for over a decade. He looked at the boy's lightning bolt scar and saw not just a mark of paternity, but a mark of survival. The origin of Toby wasn't just a biological fact. It was a testament to a mother's love that had defied time, distance, and the very men who had tried to turn her son's father into a lab specimen. Determined to find the physical evidence of Amara's life and death, Obinna hired a private investigator who specialized in discrete cases in the East. Together, they began to follow a paper trail that led from the high-rises of Lagos back to the dusty, red earth roads of a small village outside Enugu called Umuaka. This was the place where Amara had hidden, a community where she was known as a widow who kept to herself and worked as a seamstress. Obinna found bank records, school registrations, and medical files, all under various aliases, but all linked by the same thumbprint. He saw the progression of Toby's life through these documents: a B in mathematics, a vaccination record, a small loan for a sewing machine. It was a life of quiet dignity and constant vigilance, a life that existed in the cracks of the modern Nigerian state. Every document was a piece of the puzzle, a way for Obinna to touch the life he had been denied, a way to see the woman Amara had become after she let him go. The trail eventually led to a local police station in Enugu, where a dusty file sat in a cabinet labeled unresolved. The investigator managed to secure a copy of the incident report from the night Amara died. As Obinna read the details, his hands began to shake. The report mentioned a specific tattoo on the arm of one of the suspects seen fleeing the scene, a stylized serpent eating its own tail. It was the same symbol he had seen on the letterhead of the syndicate that had funded the Zenith Restoration Center. The debt hadn't been forgotten. It had been sold and traded until it became a death warrant. Amara had known they were coming, and her final acts were all focused on Toby's safety. She had mailed the photo and the birth certificate to a trusted friend with instructions to give them to Toby if she didn't come home. The paper trail wasn't just a history. It was a roadmap of a woman's final, desperate gamble. Obinna realized that he couldn't stay in the safety of Lekki any longer. He had to go to Amuka, to the place where his life had been saved and where Amara's had ended, to find the one thing the paper trail couldn't give him, the truth of who he really was. Driving into Amuka was like driving into a dream he had been trying to have for 12 years. The air was different here, thicker, smelling of damp earth, palm wine, and the ancient, heavy scent of the Irako trees. As Obinna walked through the village square, he felt eyes on him, not the suspicious eyes of strangers, but the wide-eyed, hushed recognition of people seeing a man they thought was long gone. An elderly woman selling roasted corn dropped her tongs when she saw him, her hand going to her mouth as she whispered a name he hadn't used in a lifetime, Obi. He wasn't the architect Obinna here. He was the man who had lived in the small cottage by the stream, the man who had helped repair the village school, and who had danced at the New Yam Festival with the most beautiful girl in the county. This was the village of echoes, where every corner held a memory he couldn't quite grasp but could feel in his bones. He realized that the lost year wasn't lost to the people here. It was a cherished chapter of their history, a time when a broken man had found his soul in the red dust of their roads. He visited the cottage by the stream, now abandoned and reclaimed by the forest, the roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. Inside, he found a small wooden carving of a bird, its wings spread as if in flight, a piece of art he realized, with a shock of recognition, that he had carved himself. The tactile memory of the wood against his palms, the smell of the shavings, it all came rushing back with a physical intensity that made him drop to his knees. He saw the ghost of Amara in the corner, laughing as she fanned a coal fire, and the phantom of a younger himself, his arm wrapped in bandages, but his eyes full of a light he hadn't seen in a decade. This village was the site of his true recovery, the place where he had been a man of flesh and blood, not blueprints and budgets. But the echoes weren't just happy. They were laced with the sound of approaching engines and the smell of smoke. He remembered the night he had been forced to leave, the way Amara had pushed him into a waiting car, her face a mask of terror and love. She had stayed behind to face the echoes so that he could run to the silence. Standing in the ruins of his former home, Obinna finally accepted that he was the ghost, and this village was the only place where he was truly alive. The village cemetery was a quiet, overgrown plot of land on the edge of the forest, where the headstones were often just simple wooden crosses or stacks of stones. The rain began to fall as Obinna approached the newest mound of earth, a steady, mournful drizzle that turned the red soil into something that looked like drying blood. He found the grave easily. It was the only one with fresh flowers, a bunch of wild lilies that were already wilting in the damp heat. The headstone was a simple piece of granite, but the inscription was what broke him. Amara. She waited for the light. There was no last name, no dates, just a declaration of a woman who had lived her life in the shadows, waiting for a man who would never remember her. Obinna fell to his knees in the mud, his expensive suit ruined, his dignity forgotten. He wept for the woman who had sold her soul to save his, for the child who had grown up without a father, and for the man he might have been if he hadn't been saved by a lie. As he knelt there, the sounds of the forest seemed to fade, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic thumping of his own heart. He felt a profound sense of isolation, a realization that he was caught between two worlds and belonged to neither. He had a wife in Lagos who loved a version of him that was a fiction, and a love in the ground who had died for a version of him that no longer existed. The rain intensified, washing the mud over his hands, blurring the line between the man and the earth. He realized that finding the grave wasn't the end of the journey. It was the beginning of a reckoning. He had to decide which man he was going to be, the one who returned to the safety of Lekki and pretended this never happened, or the one who stayed and fought for the legacy Amara had left behind. He reached out to touch the cold stone of the grave, a final goodbye to the woman he had forgotten to love. But as his fingers brushed the granite, he felt something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Not the cold of the stone, but a sudden, familiar warmth. The silence of the graveyard was shattered by the sound of a twig snapping, a sharp, deliberate noise that cut through the hiss of the rain. Obina froze, his hand still resting on the granite of Amara's headstone, a sudden, cold fear lacing through his veins. He thought of the syndicate, the debt, and the men who had come for Amara in the night. He slowly began to stand, his muscles coiled for a fight, his mind racing through the few defensive moves he remembered from his youth. But before he could turn, he felt a hand, small, calloused, and incredibly warm, squeeze his from behind. It wasn't the grip of a killer. It was the touch of someone who knew the exact shape of his palm, a touch that sent a jolt of electric recognition through his entire body. He stood paralyzed, the breath catching in his throat, as a voice he had heard only in the echoes of his dreams spoke his name. Obi, the voice whispered, a soft, melodic sound that seemed to come from the very air itself. I didn't think you'd ever find your way back to the Red Earth. He turned slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Standing there, draped in a dark green shawl that was soaked through with rain, was a woman who looked like the ghost of the wedding photo come to life. Her face was lined with the passage of time and the weight of a decade of fear, but her eyes, those amber, piercing eyes, were unmistakable. It was Amara. She was thinner than he remembered, her hair flecked with gray, but she was vibrantly, impossibly alive. Obina felt his knees give way again, but this time she was there to catch him, her strength surprising and solid. "You're dead," he stammered, his mind unable to process the physical reality of her presence. "I found the grave. The records. The police report." Amara smiled, a sad, knowing expression that reached her eyes. "The grave is for the woman the syndicate was looking for," she said, her voice steady despite the rain. "I had to die so that Toby could live, and so that you could finally be free to choose. I never stopped loving you, Obi. I just didn't think you'd survive knowing what it cost to keep you alive." The story Amara told him in the shelter of a small, nearby hut was a masterpiece of survival and deception. She explained how she had realized that the only way to stop the syndicate was to stage her own death, using a body that had gone unclaimed at the clinic where she used to work. She had bribed the officials, faked the reports, and then sent Toby to Lagos, knowing that the syndicate would stop looking for a dead woman and her child. She had been living in the shadows of the village, watching him from afar when he arrived, waiting to see if the architect would recognize the husband. She told him about the year they had spent together, not as a tragedy, but as the most beautiful time of her life. She described the way they had planned to build a house by the stream, the way he had talked to Toby in the womb, and the way he had promised to never let the world change him. "The accident didn't just break your body, Obi," she said, holding his hands in hers. "It broke the contract you had signed with people who wanted to own your mind. Neka and I didn't just save your life. We gave you a second chance to be a man who wasn't owned by anyone." Obina listened, the pieces of his life finally clicking into place like the gears of a complex machine. He realized that his infertility hadn't been a medical fact, but a psychological block, a way for his mind to protect him from the responsibility of a past he wasn't ready to face. The recalibration was real, but it was his heart that had needed to heal before his body could follow. He looked at Amara and saw the immense cost of her sacrifice, the years of loneliness, the constant fear, the loss of her child to a woman she barely knew. He also realized that Neka was not his enemy, but his co-conspirator in survival. The two women had worked together, across a divide of distance and class, to ensure that the man they both loved could have a future. The rebuilding of his life wasn't going to be about blueprints and steel. It was going to be about weaving these two disparate worlds together. He had to find a way to honor Amara's sacrifice, Neka's devotion, and Toby's future. He wasn't a man with a lost year anymore. He was a man with two lives, and for the first time, he felt strong enough to carry both. The drive back to Lagos was a journey through a landscape that no longer felt foreign. Obinna had Amara in the car with him, hidden under a blanket in the back seat, as they crossed the border between the East and the West. He knew that returning to his life in Lekki would be the hardest thing he had ever done. He had to face Nneka, the woman who had shared his bed and his secrets for 12 years, and tell her that the ghost had returned. He felt a profound sense of duality, the love he had for the wife who had built him, and the love he had for the woman who had saved him. It wasn't a choice between two women, but a choice between two versions of himself. Would he be the man who lived in the light of Lagos, or the man who returned to the red earth of Amuaka? Or was there a third way, a way to be the man who bridged the gap? When they arrived at the house in Lekki, the tension was palpable. Nneka was waiting on the porch, her face a mask of anxiety and hope. When she saw Obinna, she ran to him, but she stopped dead when the back door opened and Amara stepped out. The two women stood face to face, the silence between them filled with a decade of shared secrets and unspoken pain. It was a moment of profound recognition, a meeting of two architects who had built the same man. Obinna stood between them, Toby emerging from the house to see the mother he thought he had lost. The choice wasn't about who stayed and who went. It was about how they would all survive the truth. "We can't go back to the lies," Obinna said, his voice firm and clear, echoing through the humid Lagos night. "The syndicate is gone, the debt is paid in blood, and the silence is over. We are a family now, in whatever way we choose to define that." Nneka and Amara looked at each other, and in that gaze, there was a tentative, fragile peace, a realization that they were no longer guardians of a secret, but partners in a new, complicated reality. A year later, the house in Lekki was no longer a sterile sanctuary of architectural perfection. It was a place of noise, laughter, and the chaotic, beautiful mess of a family that had been forged in the fire of trauma and truth. Obinna had used his resources to legally settle the debt, once and for all, using the evidence of the clinic's illegal activities as leverage to ensure the syndicate would never trouble them again. He had established a foundation in Amuaka to provide medical care and education to the village that had saved him, turning his lost year into a legacy of hope. Toby was thriving in a top school in Lagos, a boy who had two mothers and a father who finally remembered how to love him. The lightning bolt scar on his arm was no longer a mark of a secret, but a badge of honor, a symbol of a lineage that had refused to be broken. On a warm evening, as the sun set over the Lagos lagoon, casting long, golden shadows across the patio, Obinna sat with Nneka and Amara, watching Toby kick a football across the lawn. The two women had found a rhythm of their own, a friendship born of a shared history and a mutual respect for the sacrifices they had both made. They were a modern African family, redefined by the complexities of the heart rather than the strictures of tradition. Obinna felt a profound sense of completeness, a realization that he was no longer a man of empty spaces. He looked at his hands, the hands that had once been told they would never hold a child, and saw the strength of a man who had survived his own death and come back to life. The whisper from the grave had become a roar of life, and as he reached out to take the hands of the two women who had saved him, he knew that the greatest building he would ever design was the one he was standing in, a home built on the unyielding, beautiful truth. "My wife didn't betray me. She lost me and rebuilt our world in the silence of my own forgotten memory." This wasn't a story of a lie, but of a sacrifice that cost her everything. If you had to choose between a beautiful lie and a reality that could break you, which would you pick? Drop a comment below and follow for more from the shadows.